During the terrible years of the Yekhov terror, I spent 17 months in the prison queues in Leningrad. One day someone identified me. Then a woman with lips blue with cold who was standing behind me, and of course had never heard of my name, came out of the numbness, which affected us all, and whispered in my ear. We all spoke in whispers then. Could you describe this? I said, I can. Then something resembling a smile slipped over what had once been her face. Yes. Usually what I do in these, as you know, is I provide some context and then I get into the work. I can't really do that tonight because Anna Akhmatova has a life that is a poem. And so I want to weave these two together tonight. And I also want to mark that, you know, we love this stuff and we love coming out and talking about it abstractly and theoretically, and that's great and it's fun and we need that. But what you're going to hear tonight is about wisdom that is gained through suffering, through deep and profound suffering. And that's where it happens, right? The stuff that we do afterwards, privately, publicly, that's wonderful, that's necessary, that's a kind of reconnection to the world. But there's a wisdom that's gained that comes only through deep and profound suffering, and this is Anna Akhmatova tonight. So there she is, or at least according to Kuzma Petrov-Vakin. She was born, Anna Andreeva Gorenko. Please excuse my Russian pronunciation. I don't have any Russian, so this is going to be rough. Aristocratic. Those are her dates. Aristocratic family, powerful clan of landowners, hereditary passage of titles and nobility. And she grew up in what was called the Tsar's village. So she was layered in from the beginning into Russian nobility and spent a lot of time in palaces and mansions, actually, but in unusual circumstances. She met her future husband in the Tsar's village just outside of St. Petersburg. The poet Nikolai Stepanovich Gumilyov. She was shopping for Christmas presents in the department store there, and it looks like the impression was made more on her future husband than on her, because he wooed her persistently for years, occasionally attempting suicide in desperation to get her attention. She was, as you will see, a very powerful and beautiful woman. She also began law school, like Kafka, and like our next author next week, Leslie Marmon Silko. I found this really interesting. I love it when these connections emerge, that, you know, I just threw these texts together and then you get to see what emerges. Leslie Marmon Silko also had a law scholarship and abandoned it for literature. All right. This is a famous drawing of her. I'll talk about that in a minute. She began writing poetry as a teenager, and she did not care for her future husband at first, like I said, but she did listen to him when it came to poetry, because he was a renowned poet. And in fact, he started a poetic movement in Russia that we'll talk about in a minute. And so she wrote her and published her first poem in 1907 in a journal founded in Paris that was edited by Gumilyov. And she signed the poem thus in Russian, which reads, "On his hand are lots of shining rings." And she used her real name, Anna Gorenko. However, she eventually changes her name to the pseudonym Akhmatova. Joseph Brodsky, her younger friend and mentee says this was her first line of poetry, changing her name. The pen name comes from the belief that one of her maternal ancestors was Khan Akhmat, who was the last Tartar chieftain to accept tribute from Russian rulers. And according to the family mythology, Akhmat belonged to the royal bloodline of Genghis Khan. So this is the pen name she takes. She finally marries Gumilyov, and he visited her in Kiev. And the wedding ceremony took place in the church there in Kiev on April 25th, 1910. Now, she marries him and then immediately begins an affair in Paris with Amedeo Modigliani. In fact, on her honeymoon is when she meets Modigliani. And in fact, they become longtime lovers, and Modigliani did about 16, I think, nude drawings and paintings of Anna. Yes, including this wonderful one. I'm sorry, he did the paintings and drawings. She did a poem to him that reads thus: "When you're drunk, it's so much fun. Your stories don't make sense. The early fall has stung the elms with yellow flags." This is classic Akhmatova, as you'll see. It was 16 drawings he made of her. And she kept one of them. Again, these are nude drawings of her in the nude. She kept one of them hung above her sofa in whatever room she occupied, and she occupied many in her life, as you will see. When you're drunk, it's so much fun. Your stories don't make sense. All right, so look at this portrait of her. I love this. And the woman that emerges from the poetry is that woman, right? Regal, confident, aloof, powerful. Gumilyov, as I said, begins a poetic movement called Acmeism. And it's from Acme, like pinnacle. And it's a movement that's against the Russian symbolists. So the symbolists were very esoteric. They're kind of analogous to the Romantics in England, but very much interested in higher and loftier things and wanted their poetry to take you there, to transport you to. So poetry was really a means to an end. And Acmeism is more like New Criticism, if you know that, in America, or Russian formalism to some degree, in that it wanted to focus on concrete, tightly woven images. Just images. Just paint the image with the word, and that's all you need to do. The rest will happen on its own, and you'll see this in her work. So, her first published book is Evening, 1912. Her husband did not like her being a poet, but he eventually endorsed her verse because it's so good, irresistibly good. She became immediately famous because this is Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, and there's an amazing literary tradition in Russia where, especially at that time, poets and writers are the celebrities of that world, and has been so for a long time, since the modern era at least. So it includes very introspective lyrics, themes of love, a woman's personal fate, unhappy romantic relationships, not unlike a first volume of poetry for many of us. The style is concise, very tight, no long expositions of how much it hurts or how good it feels. Just let me give you a sense of this here. Here's Song of the Last Meeting. Okay, Song of the Last Meeting. My heart was chilled and numb, but my feet were light. I fumbled the glove for my left hand onto my right. It seemed there were many steps. I knew there were only 3. Autumn, whispering in the maples, kept urging, die with me. I'm cheated by joylessness, changed by destiny untrue. I answered, my dear, I too, I'll die with you. Song of the last meeting. I see that dark house again, only bedroom candles burning with a yellow, indifferent flame. Right? Just that gesture. She puts the wrong glove on her hand. That's Acmeism. That's imagism in America. It speaks volumes. It's William Carlos Williams in The Red Wheelbarrow, right? Just that is enough to speak. You don't need to go on and on and on. Just that moment. Beautiful. So she takes on this mask, which, as you know, is what really liberates you. Often, it's what liberates you to be creative, is when you can wear a mask, whether you're an actor, a writer, or a poet, or artist. And so she takes on this mask as, she kind of hides, but the hiding is also an expression, and she likes mystery and even mysticism. Here you go. Let me just let her talk. He loved 3 things in life: evensong, white peacocks, and old maps of America. He hated it when children cried, and I was his wife. Right? Just a few lines, 5 lines. Well, it's truncated, but wow, so much work being done there, right? So much meaning being conveyed there. She lived for her art. So, a case in point, you've already heard that her marriage was far from conventional. They lived separately most of the time. Often she was in Paris with her artist friend, who was a mess, by the way, Modigliano. They have a son, though, her and her husband, Lev, who's going to come back into the story repeatedly. And he was born on September 18th, 1912, and she immediately gave him to her mother-in-law. But she got work to do. There are many men in Anna's life, including other poets and artists, as you've already heard. One was Osip Mandelstam, who wrote a poem called Akhmatova. I imagine there were lots of poems about Akhmatova, but this is the one that got published. So before I read it, you should know that Rachel is an actress at the time, and she's playing a figure named Phaedra. So here's the poem that Mandelstam wrote about her. And check out that image, that portrait, as you hear it. She turned right around, oh sorrow. I mean, right? That's just right there. She turned right around, oh sorrow, towards indifferent onlookers. Turned stone. From her shoulders a shawl, quasi-classical, flowed. Ominous voice drunk with pain, rising from heart's depths there, like this, as indignant Phaedra, Rachel, once held the stage. Now, I am tempted to rename the Philosophical Research Society the Stray Dog, because this place sounds amazing. It's an underground club in Russia where lots of interesting things happen. The Poetry Foundation page says that the customers were intoxicated with art and beauty, and I would imagine other things as well. Akhmatova encounters many of her first lovers there at the Stray Dog, including the man who had become her second husband, Shilenko, another fan of hers. She also had an affair with the composer artillery. And apparently the subject, this composer, is the subject of this poem, this brief poem. We are all carousers and loose women here at the Stray Dog. You are smoking a black pipe. The puff of smoke has a funny shape. I've put on my tight skirt to make myself look more svelte. Amazing. So interestingly, there's this very bohemian expression and life that she's living and expressed in her poetry, and yet there's this nagging kind of haunting guilt. I don't know if this is something in Russian culture, but it was certainly in Akhmatova. So let's see. Oh yes, of course. This is Boris Mikhailovich Eichenbaum, one of her first biographers, in an essay called Anna Akhmatova, An Attempt at Analysis. He called her half nun, half whore. Remember that. I bet you will, but remember that later. So, again, the ways to wisdom, life, and works. Look at that. Piercing eyes. So she publishes White Flock in 1917, her third collection. Now she's gone from love poetry and kind of darkness and mysticism to patriotic lyrics. All right? Look at the date. Right? That's why. The Russian Revolution. This is... White Flock was begun on the day that Germany declared war on Russia. And she decides, Akhmatova decides that she must purge her memory of the Stray Dog and that kind of life in favor of her homeland. I mean, this is an amazing move for a poet. And she says, here is a poem called In the Name of Freedom, written on May 25th, 1917. So you heard the other poems, right? Now listen. We aged 100 years, and this descended in just 1 hour as a stroke. The summer had been brief and now was ended. The body of the plowed plains lay in smoke. The hushed road burst in colors, then a soaring lament rose, ringing silver like a bell. And so I covered up my face, imploring God to destroy me before the battle fell. And from my memory, the shadows vanished of songs and passions. Those shadows vanished of songs and passions. Burdens I'd not need. The Almighty bade it be. With all else banished, a book of portents terrible to read. I don't know if you've experienced that, but sometimes one of the most haunting things is memory. Right? And it's memory of a life that you lived. Not a bad life. I don't think she's renouncing that life. I think she's just shifting her focus appropriately as a Russian woman in the early 20th century who sees herself as the voice of her people. The memory, man, what a ghost. What a haunting thing. And that's what I hear when I hear this poem. Because you're not that person anymore. That's why I call it a ghost. And so you walk around with these memories, but they're not yours. Or maybe they're yours, but they're not you. And it's no wonder that we have all these literary and filmic images of voices from the past, accusing, accosting, or at least just kind of nagging and being present and reminding you of someone you were but now are not. We're never that one thing. We're never that one thing. That's an illusion we carry around for practical reasons, but it's a very thin illusion. It disappears quite quickly. She has continued suitors. She addresses a poem to one that has the line, "No, Tsarevich, I am not the one, and no longer do my lips kiss, they prophesy." She was born on St. John's Eve, I didn't know this, a special day in the Slavic folk calendar when witches and demons were believed to roam freely, and she counted herself among them. Many of her contemporaries acknowledged that she was a Cassandra-like figure who had some gift of clairvoyance. The revolution. She could tell something was coming, right? I mean, there's the war, but there's also the Bolshevik revolution. And many of her friends, most of her friends and colleagues immigrated because they saw what was happening. She deliberately stayed. In fact, she chides them for leaving. She writes poems about them leaving. She ends up actually living in one of those palaces I mentioned in St. Petersburg because she was still a beloved figure even to the Bolsheviks. That will change, of course, as it always does. Largely, she was treated well because of her husband and his reputation. Sorry, another husband, hang on. Shileko, a brilliant Assyrian scholar of Assyria, and a professor at the Archaeological Institute. So because she was married to him, but also because she was well-known and well-received still, they got to stay at a palace, one of the nicest palaces in St. Petersburg. All right. She writes 2 new works in 1922, and this is because of the revolution. They're paying attention, the Bolsheviks are paying attention to overthrowing the aristocracy in Russia, and so they're not paying that much attention to the artists who stayed. And so she has this brief moment of creative freedom. She's very involved in poetry readings and salons and as such around St. Petersburg. But she is resentful of her friends who have left. She writes to one of them, "You are an apostate for a green island." He went to England, an apostate for a green island. Here's the poem, I have it, sorry. "You're an apostate for a green island you betrayed your native land, our songs and our icons and the pine above the quiet lake." So she actually becomes a kind of patriotic poet, but not for the shallow reasons you might think. She was actually, from what I can tell, more invested in the language of her homeland and the cultural treasure that was. And for good reason. This is the language of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Pushkin, etc. This seems to be where her faith lies, is in the Russian language. And she believed that frankly, a poet could not write except in her own country. So no wonder there's the strong language of betrayal regarding her friends and colleagues. Now, of course, she has this positive reverential attitude toward Russia, at least its language, especially its language. And of course, that will later get turned into a shallow kind of patriotism or nationalism. But we'll get to that in a minute. So here is Akhmatova talking about St. Petersburg after the revolution. "When the capital by the Neva, forgetting her greatness like a drunken prostitute, did not know who would take her next." Yeah. It's not that she was not tempted to immigrate. She recalls that a voice came to her, calling out to her, she says, comfortingly, saying, "Leave." It was a way to escape the Bolshevik hell that emerged fairly quickly. But and of course she doesn't say this is about herself. She has a character in one of her poems say it. So this character has a voice come to her, and this is what she says. But calmly and indifferently, I covered my ears with my hands, so that my sorrowing spirit would not be stained by those shameful words. She was in. She was all in. Here's another one, Petrograd, 1919. No one wants to help us because we've stayed home. Because loving our city and not winged freedom, we preserved for ourselves its palaces, its fire and water. Right? This is no shallow, thin patriotism or nationalism. This is poetry for a Russia that was about to be lost, and lost all the more rapidly because of the disappearance of its poets for the Green Island and other places. Of course, it doesn't take long. 1925, merely 8 years after the revolution begins, her publications are officially suppressed, because this is what happens. She is banned in this land that she loves. And so she writes Requiem. You'll see the date of publication there. That's not incorrect, and it's not accidental. And this is where we get our passage tonight, by the way. Now the poetry, you heard the poetry at the beginning being profound and imagistic love poems, and then it becomes patriotic. Now it becomes cryptic and mystic and dense and layered and intertextual. And let me give you an example. Requiem begins with a short piece of prose about standing in line at the central prison in Leningrad, waiting to hear word of Lev, her son's fate. So the passage we read about, remember, she's standing in line and someone comes up and whispers, because that's all they did was whisper, "Can you describe this?" And she does, and that is in Requiem especially. Her son being taken prisoner broke her repeatedly, actually, as you'll hear. And now she turns her gift to lament, to Jeremiads. She says, for example, that now Leningrad is now like a useless appendage swung from its prisons. The city she loved, the city she revered, the city she praised is now a useless appendage swinging from its prisons. Wow. And then talking about the loved ones, not just Lev, but the other people she knew, and the other people who were taken away in the middle of the night. She said, "They led you away at dawn, and I followed you like a mourner." And that is the book Requiem. That is her following, not just Lev, but the other people who are taken away. Taken away. Who would have thought that this would be happening again in 2019? The Requiem is a mosaic. I initially put pastiche, but I think that's too shallow. I think it is a mosaic. It's a deeper kind of integration of different kinds of voice, meter, stanzas, prose and poetry, rhyme patterns. And that all goes to articulating a disintegration of the self, because that's what's happening now to Anna, is a disintegration of the self. She's lost her homeland. She's lost her son, and she's still haunted by these memories of that beautiful time before, when she was alive and loving and living and breathing and writing. Now it becomes a dirge, a eulogy. And so the appropriate form for that, and this is so important in Russian literature, is that form itself has meaning. And so she changes, and so there's folk songs here. There's actual morning rituals in the poetry. There are the Gospels. They're here. And of course, lyric poetry. Let me see if I can. Yeah, here, listen to this. Death becomes something to be desired. You will come in any case, speaking to death, so why not now? I'm waiting for you. I can't stand much more. I've put out the light and opened the door for you, death, so simple and miraculous. There is this wonderful poem called I Erected a Monument More Solid Than Bronze. That's actually Horace, but she's playing on that. Let's see if I have it. Yeah. Listen to this. So remember where she was, right? She was in the Stray Dogs. She was right there. You know that kind of life where you're like right on the edge of life, the cutting edge of life, and it's glorious and dangerous and fun and bizarre. And then she sees what happens to her country, and she switches to patriotism. And now, listen, if ever in this country they decide to erect a monument to me, I consent to that honor under these conditions. That it stand neither by the sea where I was born, my last tie with the sea is broken, nor in the Tsar's garden, that little place where they lived, near the cherished pine stump, where an inconsolable shade looks for me. But here, where I stood for 300 hours, and where they never unbolted the doors for me. Another stanza. I'd like to name them all by name, those who have been dragged away, those who have been disappeared. But the list has been confiscated and is nowhere to be found. I have woven a wide mantle for them from their meager, overheard words. Yes, you did. You wove a wide mantle for them in a book called Requiem. So she becomes a poet in exile at home. Right? She didn't leave. She castigated those who did, and now she's trapped after the revolution. She identifies, and I love that this happens, with Dante, who was our third discussion, because he too was exiled from Florence. He is, for her, the quintessential poet now, a poet living away from his land, right? Which she said could not be done. You cannot write poetry except in your homeland. And now she's in her homeland, but she's not of it. She writes of Dante, but barefoot and in a hair shirt with a lighted candle, he did not walk through his Florence, his beloved perfidious space longed for. She knows that pain that produced the Divine Comedy. Let's see, here's the city beloved by me since childhood. Listen to this voice. The city beloved by me since childhood seemed to me today in its December silence like my squandered inheritance. But with a stranger's curiosity, captivated by each novelty, I watched how the sled skimmed and listened to my native tongue. And then she becomes quite literally the exiled poet. As the German blockade tightens around St. Petersburg, they actually call upon Akhmatova to remembering her previous nationalism, or what they took as nationalism. The revolutionaries call and ask her to do a series of radio transmissions, organized by a literary critic, in fact. And she gladly participated and once again became famous for this. But eventually she cannot last there, and she is evacuated to Tashkent, which is Uzbekistan, I believe. So she writes, for example, now, in exile, she begins to write more epic and philosophical poems that are laced with a kind of civic duty. And we will preserve you, Russian speech. See, there it is. It's the language. And we will preserve you, Russian speech, mighty Russian word. We will transmit you to our grandchildren, free and pure and rescued from captivity forever. So again, revolutionaries will take this, the nationalists will take this and use it for their purposes, which always happens. But for her, she's mourning the loss of a culture and trying to preserve it, specifically a culture of language. So she returns, 1944. She returns to St. Petersburg full of renewed hope. But just before that, the state had relaxed control over some of the art, and some of her poetry was published finally, and was helped by some who were still there, some artists and writers who were still there. And then something very weird happens with Isaiah Berlin. You may know Berlin as a philosopher, British, he's in London, and he finds Akhmatova enthralling, as apparently every man who met her did, and he wants to visit her. Okay, well, this is a terrible idea, right? A British citizen visiting her just after she comes back, but apparently, I don't know, he was clueless or in love or whatever. And so they see this guy, this renowned British philosopher, come visit Akhmatova, and the spies say, well, something's going on here. It wasn't, as far as we know, but he arranges 2 private visits with her, saw her again in January 1946, and she does not blame him. I'm blaming him, but she does not blame him, and cherished the memories that they had. Night-long conversations. Who's a brilliant scholar, and she writes of him, of these meetings. Sounds die away in the ether, and darkness overtakes the dusk. In a world become mute for all time, there are only 2 voices, yours and mine. So, of course, this will not stand, and the Communist Party resolution of 1946 singles out 2 magazines for publishing Akhmatova's works, and they were deemed, unworthy and decadent. The secretary of the party dismissed Akhmatova's verse also as pessimistic and rooted in bourgeois culture. She was denounced as a nun and a whore. Remember? So they looked up that 1923 essay and used both as a denunciation. She's a nun, that's bad, and after the revolution, right? And she's a whore. She was expelled. And I know we think of this here in America today as like a kind of censor. This is life-threatening, because she was expelled from the Union of Soviet Writers because of this, which means she didn't have a ration card, so she couldn't get food. So this is life-threatening, this expulsion, this denouncing of her by the state. All of her recently published books that had come out during that relaxed time are now destroyed. Further publications of her poetry were banned. And most significant, her son, Lev, was rearrested in 1949. So now she writes poetry to save her son. So Stalin's now in power, And you may know that Stalin was a poet himself before he became Stalin. And so he had a heavy hand in artistic censorship and production in Russia. So she wrote a dozen patriotic poems praising Stalin, glorifying the motherland, wrote of her happy life in the Soviet Union. We've seen this before. It's coerced poetry. The lies that come from the West. It was a desperate attempt to save her son. It did not work. Stalin saw right through it and did not find her credible in her praise of him. And from this comes Poem Without a Hero. It is her most significant creative work, and I think it's probably safe to say it's her masterpiece. It was begun in 1940 and edited, rewritten for 20 years, and then it's published in 1965. It is incredibly complex, abrupt shifts in time. You know, before with Requiem, we saw playfulness. Playfulness is not the right word. We saw a deployment of different types of form within the book and within particular poems. Now, we're going much, much deeper, shifting time, disconnected images linked only by cryptic allusions, right? Half quotations. Sotto voice, the character talking to herself under her voice, right? This is all part of the Poem Without a Hero, and many more techniques like this. It's a long narrative poem that critics say reflect memory as a moral act. So now memory is a moral act, whereas before it was a kind of haunting. It was a kind of condemnation even. Now it becomes a moral act to recover this longer memory, this memory of a life now largely lived as she approaches her death. So memory is a moral act, a ritual of expiation. She's trying to, in this writing, she's trying to expiate something. She's trying to get rid of something that's killing her. She's trying to become new. And then a funeral lament, which she got very good at. All right, so, yeah. So this is really amazing because she goes back to that stray dog era, and she has these characters come back in her poem, in Poem Without a Hero. This elegant, carefree decadence, sensuality, etc. They come back into her poem, but they're all dead, and they arrive in comedic costumes and engage what she calls a hellish harlequinade. So this is also about poetic atonement. Only how did it come to pass, she writes, that I alone of all of them am still alive? Yeah? She feels compelled to atone for the collective sins now of all those friends at the Stray Dog and during that time. This is the expiation, right? And this is for a better future for her country. And so there's this conflation of the past, present, and future and all these memories, and it's a really difficult and dense and rich poem. And she writes here, for example, as the future ripens in the past, so the past rots in the future. And here is, here's a stanza. And from behind barbed wire in the very heart of the taiga, the forest, I don't know which year, having become a heap of camp dust, Having become a terrifying fairy tale, my double goes to the interrogation. My double. So this is brilliant, right? So it's her double because she's remembering, but it's her double because it was other people. So those other people are her double, right? She's reliving this, but in a very interesting and creative way. And so this is hero-less poetry. It reminds me of Hazel Motes in Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood, the Church of Christ without Christ. Hero-less poetry. And here's an example of it. So one of the scenes in Poem Without a Hero is the suicide of a young poet and soldier who killed himself out of unrequited love for a beautiful, seductive actress. You see, her double, right? This could easily have happened to her. Maybe it even did. And this beautiful, talented actress becomes a stand-in for Anna. So here you have right? You have a suicide of a man who is pining for a woman who does not love him back. That's the stuff of epic poetry, epic love poetry. Not for Akhmatova. Of all the ways for a poet to die, foolish boy, he chose this one. He could not bear the first insult. He did not know on what threshold he stood and what road spread its view before him. Damn, right? Foolish boy, you died for love, you idiot, right? Because he didn't follow the path. And that's the problem with suicide, isn't it? You think that the road is done. You think that your path has come to an end, but it doesn't. There's more. There's a whole, what does she say? He did not know on what threshold he stood. He was right there. And what road spread its view before him. And some critics have said that the only real hero of Poem Without a Hero is time. Amazing. I love this monument to Akhmatova on the Neva. So she identifies herself as the chorus. You know the chorus from ancient Greek tragedy, right? It's the voices that come in to frame the events and provide commentary, right? To help the viewer understand how to interpret things and to guide that interpretation and to say that's good and that's bad. She puts herself in this book, in this Poem Without a Hero, as the chorus. All right. Let's see. All right. So here's 3 lines from that. He will come to me in the fountain palace to drink New Year's wine, and he will be late this foggy night. He will be late because he's still alive, so he cannot join this party. Right? This is a meeting of ghosts from the past, and so he never comes because he's alive. And it's probably true that was Isaiah Berlin, by the way, the guest from the future who cannot arrive. Yes, this is an esoteric work, not in the way we usually talk about it here, but in the sense that it's hidden, unclear, deep meanings that are only glimpsed at. And she refused to provide interpreters any help with it. Let's see, what does she say? She admits that her style is a, quote, secret writing, a cryptogram, a forbidden method. Actually, that is kind of how we talk about secret writing, a cryptogram, a forbidden method, and confesses to the use of invisible ink and mirror writing in Poem Without a Hero. Stalin dies in 1953. Yes. Now she is free to travel. She goes to Italy to receive a prize in poetry. She goes to England, where she was awarded an honorary doctorate from Oxford University, where she says she spent most of her time there correcting students' dissertations. She stops briefly in Paris. What memories must that have evoked? And she dies 13 years later on the same day as Stalin. She received full recognition in her homeland only in the 1980s. Amazing. She died in 1966. And then her previously unpublished works finally become available to the general public. And in 1989, her centennial birthday was celebrated there in the palace in St. Petersburg. And there are actually several monuments to her. There is one. Here she is. I mentioned she didn't want Poem Without a Hero interpreted. Here's what she says. Rumors have frequently reached me concerning false and absurd interpretations of Poem Without a Hero. Someone has even advised me to make the poem more comprehensible. I will refrain from this. The poem does not contain any third, seventh, or 29th meanings. I will neither change it nor explain it. What I have written, I have written. Just to give you a little taste of Poem Without a Hero. Enough. I've frozen in fear too long. So now I'll summon Vox Jaconi, and with it a man will come to me. It's not for him to be my espoused, but what we together will bring about will trouble the 20th century. I received him by mistake, as one touched by a hidden fate, and with him the worst of all drew near. Along the Fontanka Canal he'll walk. Arriving late through night and fog, he'll drink my wine to greet the new year, and he'll remember Epiphany Eve, the maple, the wedding candles' beams, and the poem in its mortal flight, but not the first lilacs of the spring, nor love's sweet prayers, nor yet a ring. Its doom he'll come bearing me that night. And I was able to find a recording of her. And here she is reading her poem on Dante in her native language.
Клеопатра уже целовала Антония мертвые губы, уже на коленях пред Августом слезы лила, и предали слуги. Грохочут победные трубы под римским орлом, и вечерняя стелится мгла. И входит последний, плененный ее красотою, высокий и статный, и шепчет в смятении он, тебя как рабыню в триумфе пошлет пред собою. Но шеи ребячьи все так же спокоен наклон, а завтра детей закуют. О, как мало осталось ей дела на свете, еще с мужиком пошутить, и черную змейку, как будто прощальную жалость, на смуглую грудь равнодушной рукой.
Joseph Brodsky was her mentee, and quite a bit younger than her, but he was enthralled with her. This is his reflection on Anna Akhmatova. We did not go to her for praise or literary recognition or any kind of approval for our work. We went to see her because she set our souls in motion, because in her presence you seemed to move on from the emotional and the spiritual level you were on. You rejected the language, and you spoke every day for the language she used. Of course, we discussed literature, and we gossiped, and we ran out for vodka, and listened to Mozart, and mocked the government. Looking back, though, what I hear and see is not this. In my consciousness surfaces one line from the same Sweetbriar and Blossom poem. You do not know what you were forgiven. This line tears itself away rather than bursting out of the context because it is uttered by the voice of the soul. For the forgiver is always greater than the offense, and whoever inflicts it. This line, seemingly addressed to one person, is in fact addressed to the whole world. It is the soul's response to existence. It is this, and not the ways of verse making that we learned from her. Thank you for letting me introduce you to this amazing woman.